Greetings, everyone. My name is Felix, and I've been working on the Reefs of Jamaica officially since 2022 as a University of the West Indies graduate with Seascape Caribbean, private contractor. This investigation I've been spearheading through the White River Finch Sanctuary, which is one of our 23 plus community-based no-take fishing zones. We're located on the central north coast, and most recently I'm responsible for the Wave Change program in Jamaica. This presentation will be given on the 12th of December at the Reef Futures conference in Cancun, but it's also was recently delivered to the community at White River in Ocho Rios, following a one-year consultancy for the non-profit. This intervention is really best described as an endangered species recovery plan, specifically for Aquapora, well, mainly for Aquapora, most critically threatened and most keystone reef-building coral species in the Caribbean, or perhaps more accurately, a last-ditch salvage mission following what could be described as the first step in the country's first population genetics guided approach to inventory and bank on every last survivor of the genus at a time when we acutely lost comfortably 98% of our remaining live cover of the species. Of course, I'm referring to the El Nino event of 2023, when we had above 31 degree temperatures for a consecutive 4-month or 3.5 month period. By the end of which we were looking at a near genus level extirpation for Aquapora, consequently the eradication of all nursery material down to zero, and 15 to 20 years plus worth of work entirely reversed. So we were looking at the eradication of almost all wild stock, 95%, if not more, at a glance. We were supposedly in Jamaica at the epicenter of this global heat spike, this regional heat spike at the time. I'm not sure how that works, but it certainly seemed to be the case. Climate Central ranked Jamaica as highest of all 175 countries assessed in its climate shift index, suggesting that the island suffered more than any other in 2023. But also anecdotally, we did hear from colleagues in islands like Hispaniola and Cuba that they maybe retained 40 to 50% of those species. That on the north coast of Cuba, you can still see these car-sized elkhorns that we just don't have anymore in Jamaica. But we did in August of that year. In Costa Rica, down on the isthmus, we've heard reports of 40% survivorship and a 60% die-off. Cayman, almost obliterated, just like us. It's too close to home to be any different, so I didn't expect to see any difference, but I was fortunate enough in holidays, for example, to do some extensive swims to really try and gauge whether or not they were any different to us, considering their reputation versus ours, but also their geographical proximity. And I mean, it turns out that really they're down to pretty much nothing, just the way we are. But they do have some survivors out there. The only way to really know will be to do the same project in that location as well. But yes, the Central Caribbean was seriously affected. We took part in a 2023 survey with the Nature Conservancy under their Coral Carib multi-country project to create a sequence of 4x4 meter photomosaic plots within our different MPAs in Jamaica. So we unfortunately produced our first mosaic plot while the bleaching was already underway. It would have been very cool to have done one in August before the heat kicked in to really compare healthy to deceased. But we did our first plot actually in October. This was not representative of Aquapora, but it really gives you an idea of how events transpired for our most common species, so our typical reefscape. So here you're looking in October at, for the most part, everything stark white. All this Parietes finger coral is bleached, although you've still got some color, some natural healthy color on the fire coral on top here. Moving into November, you can see, if you were to half close your eyes and look at this, just the color scheme alone kind of gives you an idea of the area. Compare that now to the December mosaic where the fire coral is now dead and no longer white. You don't see the white so much. You can see the finger coral is largely regaining color, and so in fact are the Orbicella to a large extent. You can see color creeping back into the surfaces of those older corals, some of them, particularly this one in the middle here. That's to really give you an idea of how matters transpired for our other more common species. Sadly, we cannot say the same about our most critical Aquapora. So as far as this genus is concerned, from early October, we realized that we were no longer dealing with a bleaching event, but a local extinction. And I'm going to be totally honest and admit that that's not just for Aquapora, although that's where our energy has been focused, but also for Melepora and Agaricea, so for fire coral species and lettuce corals, both of which are potentially even more rare than Aquapora at this stage, which is mind-blowing, having gone from being prolific weedy species the month before. You can just look at pictures from other countries now where the heat wave didn't linger as long and immediately tell it's not Jamaica just by the contrasting color scheme due to the presence of fire coral alone. So consequently, we've been dealing with the unavailability of live tissue for the continuation of nursery programs island-wide, the loss of previously extant genets available for restoration, so no parent stock. So how do you kickstart a breeding population again? The greatest ever setback to genetic and phenotypic variation ever, and therefore resilience-based management, because if the goal is to find as much diversity out there as possible, including stronger, seemingly climate-adapted genets, where do you start if there's literally nothing there that we can find? And anything that did survive, of course, is so isolated now that the predators have moved in more intensively. So intensified predation of our remaining survivors. So for example, you might find one elk-horn colony the size of your hand with 20 snails on it. Of course, maintaining those and keeping them alive, if they're very far-flung colonies in remote locations, is very logistically intensive. So our response to that is to conduct prompt salvage, but we really need to be able to rescue these corals and bring them up to strategically located repositories. I just want to say that for us, Belize's Fragments of Hope is hands down the benchmark for aquapora conservation, regionally, globally. And I believe that the reason for that, in addition perhaps to being an extremely balanced ecosystem comparatively by today's standards, unlike Jamaica, and well managed, I believe the reason is because they did what we're now doing, but back when there was more out there. So, we're now picking up the pieces after the apocalypse. They did it 20 years ago before it was too late. And of course, what I'm referring to is a population genetics guided approach to mix and match genets from far and wide, resulting in maximized variation 20 years down the line, and consequently a comparatively higher survivorship following events precisely like the one last year. So now that we've lost everything, only now we're officially looking for everyone that's left. So where were we at prior to September 2023? In terms of nurseries, Jamaica has 23 community-managed MPAs island-wide. We call them fish sanctuaries, 15 of which formerly had nursery programs leading up to last autumn. Discovery Bay Marine Lab, Bluefields, Seacam in the Portland Bight Marine Protected Area, Alligator Head Foundation in Portland, Oricabessa, Boscobel, White House, Negril, UE Port Royal, us at White River, Iberostar in Grange Pen, Lilliput, and then outside of that network, there was one private practitioner in Port Royal. And then Andrew from Seascape had his sites in Montego Bay, and prior to that in Hanover as well, at Round Hill. By November, those that were still up and running were each discontinued. And in some cases, 15 to 20 plus years worth of work to propagate and restore the genus was reversed. So far, only 3 of them have started back, and that's because of extensive mapping to source surviving donors. So specifically implementing the methodology that I'm presenting today. I clarify that I'm speaking specifically in terms of aquapora for branching coral species. Alligator Head, for example, has persevered with boulder species, specifically ex situ as well. In terms of wild stock, I think we had probably about 20% remaining live cover, despite our reputation for overfishing, pollution, tourism, malpractice, mega hotels, all of which is true, and consequently being a terrible scuba destination. We did actually have a noteworthy remaining live cover of all 3 Atlantic aquaporids leading up to this event. Until so very recently, aquapora continued to be a main component of Jamaica's live coral matter, and you really didn't have to swim far to see this. You could still buck up on large adult-sized colonies 5 meters apart from one another in the first 2 weeks of last September. More importantly, in conducting these swims, we realized just how prolific our extant aquapora populations were as we swam over stretches of the coastline that hadn't been swum, ever maybe, by spearfishers for sure, but it's certainly not photographed. Honestly, photography alone can barely capture the spatial extent of these environments, so I've been using video mostly to try to convey their scale and the extent of this mortality event. But even then, it doesn't do it justice. All I'll say is, picture yourself swimming for 8 kilometers and seeing nothing but sloping buttresses of freshly killed stacks on stacks of elk-horn and staghorn. Polyps intact and clearly discernible. So Salt Marsh and Trelawney here, for example, that's an 8-kilometer stretch, and now you have all 3 aquaporids back to back, some assemblages entirely single strain. We lost these assemblages faster than we could find them. We missed the final days by a couple of weeks, save for the Rio Bueno one, which was the only one for which we were able to witness the 3-stage process. These photos here go to illustrate just how quickly that whole period ran its course. So every day leading up to the 1st of October was spent realizing the severity and rewriting the objectives based on how bad it was getting. So it was definitely a first-hand example of adaptive management. We started off doing the shading thing to no avail. It was simply an atypical year, so we weren't going to see any positive results from that. I, successfully deployed shades in previous bleaching events like in 2020 and was able to retain 60% of what we had under shades. But this year, anything that survived under the shade basically survived in the wild, so it was of those resilient genets. So it's not thanks to having implemented this that we retained any biomass. So simultaneously, we immediately swam our entire MPA looking for any survivors, so-called supercorals, under the assumption that we could still get away with harnessing the devastation to our advantage, so as to distinguish corals that bleached, the corals that didn't, as some were still unbleached in week 2. But by week 3, we realized that that concept belonged to a previous era. We'd now officially passed the post-extinction phase threshold, whereby that approach was obsolete. We thought, okay, so now there's no one left unbleached. There's no such thing as a supercoral, and at this point, that's from having surveyed maybe 50 kilometers. And so we're saying, okay, well, now we're just looking to distinguish bleach and die from bleach and recover. Well, that's all we can bank on now. Lo and behold, by week 3, the macroalgae began to invade, and by October the 1st, we were looking at an island-wide extirpation event. It was no longer a bleaching event, but anything that was bleached was now dying. So nothing that was bleached was going to bounce back. It was either bleach and die, or don't bleach at all. But to find those corals that didn't bleach at all, we would have to swim the entire island. So that was when we commenced cross-parish swims to find the survivors. So we had to liaise so as to fill in the gaps between one another and ensure that all that ground gets covered, because, there was 20 or so restoration programs in Jamaica. So we started a WhatsApp group. It now has 40 participants in 7 different parishes. Only 3 were really putting in the swimming miles, to be fair, but just on a national level, WhatsApp's been hugely useful for us to let one another know where we've mapped, who's been where we still need to go, if we can team up on certain dates. And it's also incredibly useful to have this network because there's people in the group who may not necessarily be reef managers, but might live adjacent to sites where survivors are found and can therefore provide ease of access to those sites, support us with logistics, or monitor on their own behalf. And of course, having a WhatsApp thing, it's also quite easy to incorporate community members. So not just people who work directly for these organizations, but spearfishers who have empirical observations to contribute and also the physical capacity to take part. So the survey technique basically consists of conducting swims averaging 5 kilometers per day, maybe 6 kilometers a day, up to about 13. So we drift with the current from one entry point to one exit point, doubling back on either the shallow or deep sections of reef. So typically in Jamaica, we have a shallow crest, a long fringing reef that's flanked by an outer spur and groove buttress system on a slightly deeper section. And so you'd have to break it up between multiple days, or you'd have to double back, all the while swimming in zigzag patterns to ensure comprehensive visual coverage of all reef skips and coral communities. The survey belt follows the reef topography, which varies from site to site. So stretches of coastline where the width of the survey ground expands may take multiple days to complete, so we've had to break it up in certain locations. Transects won't help you. Agra won't help you. Reef Check won't help you. It's not a scientific survey. It's literally a search mission. Swim the whole reef. Don't be lazy. Don't man search. If you've lost your keys, you don't lay a measuring tape across your bedroom floor and drop a PVC bar at every 1 meter interval and glance to your left and right. You open every damn drawer. You lift up the rug. You look under the bed. You actually look. So it's not that sciencey. It's just about common sense and doing the only logical thing. Even if it doesn't seem practical from the perspective of most people's physical capacity and stamina, the only way to find a needle in a haystack is to scan the entire thing. So we georeference and we flag utilizing a handheld Garmin GPS to georeference each colony. You need a dry bag attached to a float for the GPS or a kayak. There's not much point doing this with a boat because you really can't afford to be on top of the water. You need to be in it. It'll make it easier to get to your start point, but the distance needs to be traversed beneath the surface. And you can't really miss bits by being on a boat unless you're crossing a sand patch or something. So findings are uploaded to Garmin Basecamp and exported to Google Earth. These are tracked and labeled, species, location, and then a letter assigning them an ID. So for Acropora palmata found in Discovery Bay, A in this example. And in our second phase, where we actually started gene banks in Ocho Rios, we've been labeling that way, assembling lines basically labeled as per lineage. So where are we at? We've now covered 191.64 kilometers as the crow flies, excluding semi-monthly re-swims. That's 119 miles, approximately a quarter of Jamaica's coastline. So to date, we found 276 individual colonies altogether. So that's 26 staghorn, 240 elkhorn, 9 fused staghorn, and we are definitely taking into account any pillar corals that we can find, because their extinction obviously was a result of a different die-off event, which was very much, stony coral tissue loss disease, which has driven their conservation status to a critically endangered. So any of those that we find, we obviously incorporate as well into the inventory. So this is what it looks like. And I'm going to go into Google Earth. So here we are. As you can see, we've covered the entire central north coast of the island, looking very clustered from the zoomed out angle. But from the western end of Ocho Rios all the way to Lilliput, Montego Bay, Iberostar. Here's the Iberostar nursery housing 5 genets, including this one here sourced during my tenure at White River. And then back in Ochi, here's our office at the White River Fish Sanctuary, and we have our Prospect Eastern Nursery housing all 62 of the colonies sourced between here and here. Meanwhile, for the colonies sourced in the western end of the marine park between Dunn's River here and St. Anne's Bay, we established this nursery site here, currently housing 37 genets. So for Ocho Rios, that's 99 altogether. Some sites had higher survivorship density than others. For example, Tower Isle was relatively dense, but just so that you understand, this entire reef system here was built from Elkhorn and Staghorn coral. All those dark shapes that you see there, the only bits that are alive are those blue points. So that just gives you a scale of what we're dealing with in this day and age, and each of them are less than 1 meter across in diameter. This site here at Whispering Seas was a relatively dense, shallow cluster of very healthy looking survivors. For context, these two areas, every 5 meters you would come across a large elkhorn colony, the size of a car, while swimming along this less than 300 meter stretch. But now, the only stuff that's alive are those blue points. So in the first week of September 2023, there would have been several hundred across this area alone. And now there's only 4 on your entire screen. This right here was an incredibly shallow, dense cluster that we actually monitored for spawning in that first week of September, only for it to bleach severely the following week and die within the fortnight. And the same goes for every one of the 100+ individual colonies across this area. So although at that time you really didn't have to swim very far to see individual adult colonies, there were very few sites that we knew of that actually had back-to-back colonies as far as the eye could see. One such site that we knew of was this one here at Little Dunn's River. All this dark stuff that you can see, including more than that, because actually you can't really see through the marl that's slicking off this marl shipping facility that covers this entire area that we've had to report. The elkhorn covered the entire reefscape as far as the eye could see, which we thought was rare at the time. All that's left now of that are just these individual pinpoints. So for this area alone, there's only 3 survivors. But it turns out that those types of sites were more common than we thought, but we were just too late to find them. So one of the most alarming ones was salt marsh. So as soon as you come out of Falmouth Harbour, you're into salt marsh. Now, the only site that people who studied these reefs knew of having back-to-back stacks on stacks of live acropora was Rio Bueno. So take that Rio Bueno site and multiply it by 10 kilometers, and you have salt marsh, which is this entire area. Except we missed it by 2 weeks, and you could clearly see all freshly killed coral skeleton with their polyps intact. It wasn't old mortality because it hadn't been heavily overgrown by algae yet. So that was one of the most shocking things. And just look how many blue points you see on this map right now. None at all. So that's quite indicative, I think, of the predominant reproductive tendency of these corals being asexual, because their survivorship is very low. So if one thing bleaches and dies, the entire thing bleaches and dies. Could also be that these conditions were very pristine in comparison to those of the harbour, and therefore these corals here developed slightly more resilient traits in light of the multiple anthropogenic pressures. Who knows? But swimming over miles and miles of dead reef is incredibly disheartening, especially when you can see visibly that it's freshly killed. So some clusters along the coastline are denser than others, this here being silver sands, which I consider to be a hope spot. Meanwhile, you have these isolated colonies along these large stretches of nothing but dead assemblages. For Cervicornis specifically, I think it's really important to show you that the average distance between any 2 survivors is about 10 kilometers. So this one here at Pear Tree Bottom, we're still keeping an eye on. It's heavily predated by snails, but it's still in good condition otherwise, as long as we can go back and check on it. But it's the only one of its kind you will find, or was the only one of its kind you would find up until this point here at Dairy Bull, but we've completely lost this one to snails. So the distance you have to swim to find another one of its kind is all the way over at Rio Bueno. So that's 11 kilometers, 7 miles, to find 2 survivors of the same species. So the nearest coral of its kind is 7 miles away, which is astonishing when you consider the extent to which Discovery Bay has been studied over the last half a century. And we know that this entire sloping fore reef was built from stacks on stacks of Cervicornis for miles and miles. And the same goes for this side of the bay at Pear Tree, which is famously a site for staghorn recovery over the years. However, today we only have one left and it's already dead. So there's no future recovery for this area for that species. There is, however, just this one proliferate colony that was actually paling nightly in June last year. As for Portland, we swam from Trident Castle here all the way back to Boston Bay on separate dates. And the only survivor was this one off Monkey Island, and then Lady Godiva has reported another one from this side of the lagoon. Otherwise, things aren't looking good for the East Portland Fish Sanctuary. This here at Robbins Bay, one of the shortest swims we've done in 1.5 miles. We came across 30 survivors, so that's the biggest hope spot we know of. Our densest survivorship to date, which was something we did not anticipate, but it turns out that it's a very unurbanized stretch of the coastline. If there are location-based factors contributing towards survivorship, this is the first site that has indicated as such. And we didn't even get this far, so we can expect there to be even more survivors along this stretch of the coastline. That's going to take a lot of swimming. So I give to you the resilient reefs of Jamaica. So if you take a look at our status report now, let's go down to... Okay, so this is just in the White River Nursery, and then this is just in the Mammoth Bay Nursery. So this is Ocho Rios combined. So total donors, that's 93, and that's 3 species. So the total distance swam, and then these are the sort of size classes of the specimens that we have in culture, and the number of ramets. And then in terms of, so collection dates, and these are growth rates for comparisons, but we need to take a second data set, but I haven't been brought back onto the sanctuary to do that. Overview. Okay, so these are the numbers of individual ramets that we have in culture, but they continually change because we're constantly expanding and propagating and generating new tissue. But the number of donors are listed here. So that's 59 palmata, that's 2 Cervicornis, 1 prolifera. Prospect, Duns River, Duns River, Duns River, Mammoth Bay, St. Anne's Bay, Duns River. These are just the IDs, alphabetically ordered. And here they all are, by species, location, and ID. And then, of course, the coordinates. And we have pictures to illustrate each of them. So these are some of the Whispering Seas survivors in actually incredible condition. Our Duns River genus looking incredible before and after harvesting. This is another Duns River survivor on 2 separate dates. So this is in 2023. And then in 2024, you can see that actually there was kind of patchy bleaching taking place, which was concerning. But we brought it up to the shallow threshold at Mammoth Bay at that nursery, and it's doing incredibly well. We had to sort of kind of offset the stress with the shading, but we had 100% survivorship from everything that we put out on that shade. We had some post-harvesting stress within that second week of August when we expanded that nursery and stocked it with the locally sourced Duns River material. But by September, everything was looking incredible on it. So that was really exciting. I can't say the same for this prolifera here, which is no longer in such great condition. So that's a little concerning because I'm talking about the natural colony. The ramets that we brought all the way to White River from Duns River, all the prolifera that we have at the White River Nursery is from this colony. It's the reason we still have that species in culture, and it's doing incredibly well there. But we did see some healing that we had to offset with shading. And then this is the prolifera that we hosted at Mammoth Bay, which is remarkable. This is our 1 Cervicornis from Duns River that we've got in culture at White River. And then this is the only Cervicornis from the whole eastern section of the marine park. This is the easternmost Cervicornis that we know of in Jamaica. We don't know of another one in the direction of Orgabessa, but hopefully they can find some. And here are just our survivors growing incredibly well over the period, but you can see that there is some bleaching, so some paling took place. One intervention that we conducted was bringing this down. This was one of our survivors that was located off Jamaica in the White River Fish Sanctuary. That was incredibly shallow, like literally 3 meters or so deep. And one experiment that we did was to try and bank on those tolerant genus at that incredibly high threshold based on the Corals for Conservation approach out in Fiji, where they were looking for survivors within those so-called hot pockets and bringing them to slightly greater depths where we possibly bank on them in the long run so that we don't see them die out in another El Nino in that very exposed location where they happen to survive in 2023 but might not survive in 2026 or whenever we get another El Nino. And certainly create clones of them. Here's that Duns River prolifera doing incredibly well. So in terms of photographic tracking of evolution, we have everybody in location-based folders. So for example, let's go to Silver Sands, where we've got this Silver Sands K Palmata photographed on 4th of April 2024 in incredible condition. I mean, I have earlier photographs from January 2024 when this area that's now covered in algae was actually still live tissue, but basically in the February storm it got abraded by a rope, and I still need to upload those pictures, but basically in excellent condition. This is now the 14th of June that same year, still in excellent condition. And then this is September, 23rd of September. The coral had either been hit by a boat or a storm busted up. You can see they're broken off fronds. I will follow these up with another picture because I checked it this week, and these branches have actually fused to the reef, some of them, and are showing even better coloration than in this picture. So that's why it's important to photographically trace their evolution. In terms of depth, incredibly random. In fact, one thing we attempted to do from the get-go was kind of prioritize the type of environment where we would survey and map, because for these extensive swims, it's exhausting to have to go everywhere. So we thought, okay, well, if there's more probability of finding survivors in the sort of 5 to 10 meter threshold, then let's prioritize that. But we simply weren't able to establish any such pattern. In fact, it's almost as though where there was more, there's less. Meaning, as in where we had these vast assemblages of live elkhorn and staghorn, we now have less because of the fact that, well, it's quite telling in a way of their reproductive tendency being primarily asexual, because things would just break off and colonize. Therefore, establishing these vast but genetically indiverse thickets. So if one thing dies, the whole thing dies. So if one part of it bleaches, the whole thing bleaches. Whereas, you might find one lone survivor in a completely random area surrounded by nothing but dead stuff. Long story short, we simply weren't able to establish any such pattern to survivorship, and consequently had to swim the entire country. The only location that hinted at any form of location-based factors contributing towards survivorship was Robbins Bay. In that 1.5 mile swim, we saw 30 elkhorn. So in other locations, to find another of its kind, you would have to swim maybe 20 kilometers, or perhaps 40 at this point, double that, because some of them have actually died out due to predation. So that doubles the distance between one survivor and the next of its kind. So it goes without saying that predation is ultimately the number one threat. We have actually lost entire survivors to snails because time was wasted before fragmenting remaining live tissue of these corals, propagating and getting it to safety in a nursery environment, because we weren't receiving the permission to do that during the stress event. But it was essential that we did, because that was the only way we could have maybe held on to these guys and preserved their genetic material. But now we're down to 26 survivors overall for the whole island that we know of, and that's hugely concerning. The other threats here speak for themselves. Post-bleaching related disease maybe, or late onset of bleaching, which is something that's actually quite interesting. These were corals, for the most part, that did not even bleach during the 3-month stress event, which is extraordinary. The most extreme conditions in global history that resulted in an almost extinction event for this species, to have then bleached after that event, when temperatures had already subsided. It was very strange to see if it was maybe some late stress response. But in April of 2024, we started to see some paling. We were seeing the same thing down in Trelawney. We saw a bit in St. James, and we were seeing the same in Ocho. So our response at that point was to re-implement the shading, this time to great success. So thanks to that, we were able to keep as many corals healthy as possible. But we've definitely been trying to strike a balance between the shading and exposing corals to the surface threshold as well, and to their natural environment, to try and nudge their evolution to kind of, adapt to future extreme conditions. For example, at Mammy Bay, our nursery site is actually very shallow. We've actually had to use shades to offset bleaching, but at the same time, we've brought a lot of corals much closer to the surface. So we have to strike a balance here. Okay, so in terms of rescue, we're currently dealing with 8 monitoring locations across the North Coast where we found survivors and repeatedly checking on them. Overall, that's 177 donors set to culture. So over the 94.64 kilometer stretch, that's 58.81 miles, we're incorporating them into gene banks. So in Ocho Rios, we have 2 cervicornis, that's 95 elkhorn and 2 hybrids. At Duncan's, we're keeping an eye on 14 cervicornis, 15 palmata, and 2 prolifera. At Discovery Bay, we've only found 2 cervicornis that we're keeping an eye on, and about 3 elkhorn. At Rio Bueno, we found 3 cervicornis, 3 palmata, 1 prolifera. At Runaway Bay, there's only 1 cervicornis, and we're keeping an eye on that. There were about 8 other ones that we found in November 2023, and we've since gone back and could not find them again. So that's another reason why we have to act fast. And then at Iberostar, that project has 2 cervicornis, 6 palmata, and 1 prolifera. And in Robbins Bay, there's 24 palmata that we knew of. And we did some training work with the community there to keep an eye on those. In terms of human participation in the project, that's 45 community members overall that have been sort of briefed on the project and taken part actively. So throughout 7 different communities on the North Coast, and then 18 female and 27 male. So amongst that, we have spearfishers, divers, University of the West Indies undergraduates, tourists, and young environmental activists from organizations such as the Jamaica Climate Change Youth Council, who are involved in other campaigns advocating for our natural environment. One way we've been able to bridge that sex gap is by creating opportunities for females or non-swimmers specifically to participate by, for example, propagating corals from shore that we then swim out to the nurseries. It's a story for another day, but ironically, despite being an island surrounded by water, a great many people in Jamaica don't actually swim. So in order to develop that relationship with the environment, it's important to create activities that enable first-hand experiences, but that don't necessarily require the swimming skills. And doing that also makes it more possible to have a gender balance, because typically your spearfishers are going to be boys. Those are the guys with the physical capacity that we've been relying on, certainly for the swims. I would like to know if there is another project of its kind, but for the most part, I think that we're probably dealing with the greatest in-water gene bank to exclusively host survivors of a 3-month stress event, right? So following what should have been an extinction event, we now have pulled up all the survivors across the range that we know of, and we've mapped that area so we know what's there and we know what's not there because we've swam the distance. So we can safely say that we've got everybody within the range that we have swum, and we intend to continue to expand that. I would like to know if in the region or elsewhere in the world there is another project that is both decentralized but also housing upwards of 100 different lineages. Of course, we haven't genetically sequenced anything, and much of what we have may be related, but because of the distance between survivors, I think there's a high chance that we're dealing with quite a high level of diversity genetically. And ultimately, that's where we'd like to go with this, is to really crossbreed and bank on these thermally tolerant traits to try and breed new adaptive traits into a new population based on this remaining parent stock that we have sourced, which without these swims, we would have just lost, along with the other, remaining 98% of the species that died off during that 3-week period. What strikes me is that we may be at an advantage over other islands in a depressing sort of way, having been through the apocalypse and come out the other end, as we can now at least say that while since November 2024, much of the Caribbean, especially in the southern Caribbean, has been struggling to come to terms with similar losses to those which Jamaica experienced last year, we're encouraged by the head start that we've been afforded in accepting this new reality and the work we've done this past year to make sure every last survivor have a chance. What had to die, died, so no more surprises, we think. That we're past that disappointment and we can focus solely on those genets that will see us through the decade, maybe, unless that's all there is. So where do we go from here? So the next steps would be to extend the mapping island-wide, incorporating our outer banks, extend indeed in no specific chronological timeline to other territories, nearby territories that have already found themselves in a similar position. So Cayman is a very logical next location because they find themselves in the same situation as Jamaica. It's too geographically close for it to be any different. Whereas somewhere like Cuba or Hispaniola has retained a large survivorship, they're probably going to get the shit kicked out of them in 2026 or whenever the next El Nino is going to come through. Whereas we know that we've got corals that can survive an El Nino. We hope. But there's so few of them left, we've been able to filter out the ones that weren't going to make it, whereas that's yet to be the reality for other countries. For the most part, we're seeing that maybe Jamaica's 2023 was everybody else's 2024 because we've seen, pictures from Barbados and Trinidad and Belize in November of 2024 undergoing the type of bleaching that we were experiencing in 2023. Simultaneously, we need to establish local salvage repositories and empower and train adjacent communities to oversee them. And that's actually one of the hacks that I've been implementing to ensure continued oversight of these individual survivors that are so far flung from my base. Further down the line, we need to get to a point where we can share and pair and we can cross the parish boundaries and start bringing these corals into proximity with one another for whenever the twain shall meet if the distance isn't reduced. And so how can we assist gene flow? But we also want to collaborate with those of you who can help us spawn them. Once we've got the numbers up, we can start prepping to share samples so we can crossbreed the survivors from, say, White River with the ones from, say, Montego Bay and reintroduce the new recruits to in situ repositories or strategic outplant sites where the genes can mix and match in the long term. We also need to look into biobanking them. We're all being pointed in that direction, although I don't know if we have the nationwide capacity in addition to infrastructure. But until you can do the necessary in-situ work to pull samples of these up, then you're just building ex-situ facilities either for decoration or for species of less concern, because where are you going to get the coral from? So we already are biobanking, we're just doing it in the sea, which is an essential first step to having the material with which to populate a land-based system if you can ever afford to set one up. But we can't make that investment before we've made the investment in finding the material and keeping it alive for as long as possible. We need to do them in tandem, but we simply cannot forego finding the corals, because if we don't look for them now, they will not be there in due course. We also need to continue to work as an island-wide network of practitioners to have a concerted national effort to match genetic material from far and away to generate as much variation as possible. It's no use everyone having their own lab when it's the sharing of material that's essential for this particular objective. So we're trying to make it as centralized as possible and avoid gatekeeping. Limitations include the common issue of staff turnover in the NGO sector. I'm no longer at the sanctuary. My solution is to empower different communities throughout the wider range to continue to care for the survivors mapped in their respective locations. Government's reluctance to go out of the old modus operandi has also been an issue. It's not going to work anymore. It isn't working. The only 3 programs on island left was live aquapora in nurseries and identified within MPAs out of 11 previously existing nursery programs island-wide happen to be the ones that have swum for it. So the government has been slow to license the collection and the salvage of far-flung colonies that we've consequently lost to predation. And that's an irretrievable amount of time that's been wasted and high-value surviving corals that have been lost. And even the programs with extant material still aren't hacking variation, because they're still trying to get away with growing the closest 3 colonies within their less than 150 hectare ranges. There is a nationwide conversation that's underway among former nursery programs that are hungry for the data that we've collected and also the corals that we've found. They want to know where they are, they want to be able to harvest them, because they want to start back up again. But the only barrier in their way is that the government is simply not letting them. So it opens an interesting conversation about regional sharing as well, for the sake of appropriate succession distribution-wide. Florida's failure to find their own survivors has resulted in taking from Roatan. I would say we're more than past realizing the need to jump that bureaucratic hurdle. I think is the future of endangered species conservation, certainly for species such as these. But don't, for goodness sake, discard swimming the necessary miles within our own jurisdictions, or we risk settling for the bare minimum in each location, when we could be finding everybody out there. Despite our reputation for overfishing, mismanagement, corruption, mass tourism, all that stuff, which is true, being the 3rd biggest island in the Caribbean to have a deposited aquapora framework, and until recently a really quite significant amount of extant matter, maybe roughly 20% of the former 1970s baseline, when all you could see from Mars was golden crests of elkhorn. Not only is this acute reduction in biomass in the space of 3 weeks so alarming for the rest of the region, but any success to arise from responding to that scenario, I would argue, is a valuable contribution to the conservation of this genus in our neighboring territories. So should Jamaica have any success in fleshing out these inventories and establishing gene banks, it's a victory for the sake of this species' conservation. I would normally say size doesn't matter as much as the integrity of your approach, but if your approach is to cover as much of that available range as possible, then size means something, because more distance equals more area ground truthed and potentially more survivors. And if the latter is true, then definitely more genetic variation. And that ends up being a greater success for the conservation of the species across its global distribution. So ultimately, it's about going big. And we have no choice. We have to go big to find anything anyway. And the other reason our size is worth noting is because if we can do it over such a large range, then smaller islands who have it easier than us have less of an excuse not to do the same. Without further ado, come and see us and stay in touch, because ultimately the goal here is to create as many connections with as many practitioners in locations where they have these technologies that can come and help set us up and work with our material to their benefit as well, for the benefit of the species' preservation, because it's far more attractive to go to a location where extensive work has been done, where you have access to a large parent stock of exclusively resilient corals, as opposed to a location where you've only got knowledge of 1 or 3 lineages. So lastly, of course, cannot go without saying that this project has been done with minimal funding using grant funds from the White River Fish Sanctuary, thanks to the National Conservation Trust Fund of Jamaica and the Sandals Foundation, and more recently from the Tourism Enhancement Fund of Jamaica, and we're incredibly grateful for that support. The funds were never sufficient to do this on the scale that most people would usually expect. For example, we never had a boat of our own. When the funds finally came through for that from TEF, they were never actually used to that end during the 14-month period. That did not stop us, and it did not downscale the project. We still covered more ground than a lot of formally funded organizations may have even covered, with more than double the the amount of available funding. And I really think that that's thanks to community engagement and relying on things like public transport to get around, sheer tenacity and stubbornness, obsessive compulsive swimming, making friends at different locations along the coastline where we've established monitoring sites and revisit frequently. And thanks also to all the volunteers who have participated, to loyal friendships without which transport to remote locations would have been almost impossible. Thanks to people you know who you are, who have provided us with accommodation, moral support, and useful connections, people who have lent us kayaks. Thanks also to the National Environment and Planning Agency for a recent disbursement of funds to continue monitoring, and most recently to the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who just partnered with us as part of their Blue Social Fund for engaging impacted stakeholders in marine conservation, expanding this inventory, attempting to complete the mapping of as much of the North Coast as possible within that time period, and mass scaling the number of clones in culture to provide us with sufficient backup material for future experimenting, and of course gene banking, and maybe even outplanting at local scales and the creation of on-reef repositories, on-reef gene banks in the form of outplant sites. So that there is a summary of the past 15 months worth of work. I look forward to providing a follow-up at some point in 2025 as we extend this project, transform this project, take it to new locations, I hope, and continue to secure some form of a future for these critical life forms as we progress through this severely nature-depleted period in Earth's natural history.